Next, I'd like to turn to Greg Cassidy and Chris Coarse to do their build-along segment of Chris's Conowingo model. Greg?
Thank you, Jim. Let me get my share screen up and get it started. And let me try and get through without making many mistakes. Welcome to New Tracks Build Along. I'm Greg Cassidy. This is a collaborative build of Conowingo Model's Gray Street House, the company house version in HO scale. Tonight is going to be part 3. We'll be painting the walls, trim, the windows and doors, and the roof. Our previous editions, we covered the supplies and tools needed and bracing the walls and building the foundation. If you need to, you can go back and look at those. I'll be covering techniques that any modeler probably knows. This is what I'm doing with this kit. I have a surprise. We have 3 kits, which means we'll have 3 houses for me to show you techniques on. 3 houses and 3 techniques. They'll be listed as House 1, House 2, and House 3. Through a trick of fate, I had 3 houses to work on, and I figured this will be the best way to show a variety of techniques. You can also paint your house if you want to without it looking weathered and worn. So I'll usually start off with doing some planning and testing. The carrier sheets that the walls come in are great for those because they're the same material you're going to be working on. In this case, I was trying a couple of stains from Best and from Hunterline. I decided to go with one of the stains from Hunterline. And I was trying one thing over it, which is using some whiteout correction tape. It's an interesting effect, and I'm going to play with it more. I won't be using it during tonight's build, but don't be afraid to experiment with things and see how they come out. So we'll start with House 1. I'll have the house numbers in the lower left corner. For House 1, we're going to use a technique that's dry brushing over a stain. I always take photos as I go along to judge how they come out. The camera can see a lot that the naked eye doesn't. The first step is to stain the walls. This is after they've been braced. Now, if you want an unpainted look, you could stop right now. After the stains dry, we'll be dry brushing the walls. The dry brushing technique is basically to unload most of the paint off your brush so you just have a very little on and then go over it lightly. You're putting a very small amount of paint down. This is the effect that we end up with. After you're done with that, you'll want to set them aside to dry. I'll usually take photos, including the materials that I used for such as the stain and the paint, so that I know what I used on what kits. Something that I do want to show, and this is a technique that you can play with, and you can do it before or after you paint the walls. In this case, it was after I painted the walls. Try lifting a few boards as if the wood was starting to curl and come off. You can use either a razor blade or a little X-Acto knife for doing this. For House 2, we're going to try a technique that's stain over spray paint. These are the braced walls in my spray booth. And for them, I put a light spray with a gray base coat. I didn't want the paint to be too heavy because in the next step, we're going to distress the wood. This is brushing the paint off some using either a saw or a wire brush. You don't want to take it all off, but you want to take some of it off. This is the sort of effect that you're looking for. If you're doing these techniques, you do want to watch out. You can get some little fuzzies that you'll want to try to pull off. After you've distressed the paint, then you're going to be ready to stain. In this case, I decided to use Hunterline Greige. You'll apply the wash of a stain over the walls, and I tend to make it heavier towards the bottom of the walls. That's where the walls are more exposed and where they'll weather more. This is the effect you get after you've painted, distressed the wood some, and then put stain over it. So for house 3, this is a little more involved technique. It's where we're going to sponge over the paint and the stain. There are a lot of YouTube videos showing how to do sponging on different models. The first thing we'll do is paint the walls. I used an airbrush using Vallejo paint, but you can brush the paint on as well. I did a little bit of testing to see what stain I wanted to put over the paint. It's hard to see, but I wrote down which stains I used, and then I tried a couple of different colors for sponging on. Once I decided what I was going to do, I ended up using Hunterline driftwood stain. And this is the wall with the paint and stain on it. And I'm going to start sponging paint on the wall. I use a grout sponge for this. It's kind of a closed cell sponge. There's a lot of sponges out there. This is what I like to work with. The trick in sponging is to put some paint on your sponge and then get most of it off, so that once you're dabbing it on the walls, you're just getting small bits of it on the wall. It's something you may want to play with before you start working on your model with it. This is the effect that you get after you sponge over the paint and the stain. And again, it gives kind of a worn paint look. So those are the 3 techniques I used on the houses. Next, we'll be painting the strip wood. The first thing I do is get them ready by running them through a little sandpaper. It takes off any little bits of wood that's left on them. For house 1, we did the same technique we did for the walls, and that's where we stain the wood and then dry brush over it. For house 2, the same technique where I painted it and then distressed the wood a little bit and then put stain over that. And for house 3, it was the same technique where I painted and then stained the walls and then used a sponge to go over that. Sponging over pieces of wood that small is a little trickier. You don't want to get too much paint on it, which is easy to do. This is how they come out looking after you've sponged them. The next thing we move on to is windows. Prepping the windows for painting, the first thing I did with this kit, I noticed that the tissue windows that came were 2 different sizes. And I didn't like that the smaller ones had a bit of a windowsill that the larger ones didn't. So I cut that off. That's not necessary for this kit, but it's just something that I did so they matched up. Then when prepping the walls before priming them, I usually cut off part of the sprue. I still want something to hold them by, but by doing this, I can smooth off where I cut the sprue off. And then after it's primed and painted, I only have to touch up where I cut off where it was still attached. You can cut them all the way off and clean up all the edges and then hold them down with tape as well. If I don't have a handle on something that I'm going to paint, this particular door doesn't come attached to a sprue, I'll temporarily glue something on so I have a handle to hold it with. Then again, I started going through 3 different techniques so that my windows would match the houses. For house 1, I used a Crackle Medium. You can get this at Michael's or a number of online places. You put it on before you put the paint on, and then you can paint over the Crackle Medium. I used an airbrush, but you can brush it on as well. What the Crackle Medium does is allow you to chip off the paint after the paint has dried. If you take some type of soft brush or a toothpick, then where the paint's over the Crackle Medium, you can scrape it a little bit and it gives a bit of a worn effect, which is harder to achieve over plastics and wood. For house 2, I did the same prep, but I wanted a darker color to these windows. I was looking for a dark wood effect, so I used a dark primer. The next thing I did with them is I used some artist pigments. These are dry pigments that you can put on either wet or dry. I brushed them on damp. You can get these pigments from companies such as Gamblin, AK, Earth Pigments, or Bragdon. This is the effect that I had after I put on the dark pigments. For house 3, I wanted a little bit of color in these windows, so I used a light gray primer. Then I went with a turquoise paint, but I wanted it to be very light, as if it had mostly worn off. So again, I used the sponge technique to put it on. And then after it was on, I used some more artist pigments, this time a light gray, and I brushed them on dry. And they just toned down the color of the turquoise. The next thing we're going to work on was painting the roofs. These are the undersides of the roofs. They'll always show over the edge of the model, so I always will paint them. You can paint them the house or a trim color or just some dark color. They don't stand out, but you don't want the cardboard showing. You don't need to paint the tops of the roofs. They'll be covered with roofing paper or shingles. So the rolled roofing paper that comes with this kit is a sheet of black construction paper. The technique I use for these is first I put down a light coat of gray on it. And then after that, I'll put down a light coat of some matte color, usually a dark black or a very dark gray. The next step in preparing the roofing paper is to cut it into strips. They can be between 1 and 2 foot wide. And then the technique that I use to get them to start looking like worn rolled roofing is you put it on a block where you can hang the edge over, and then use some sandpaper such as 150 grit to just sand the very edge. You're trying to get some of the black off and down to the gray. It's very easy to do. And again, there's this technique shown on a number of YouTube videos. Now, all of the techniques that we've talked about tonight will equally work on the O scale model if you've ended up with that. When we get into some of the other techniques, there will be a difference, but tonight's techniques will work just fine for either scale. Next week, we'll be starting the construction. We'll be putting the windows and doors in and starting to put the walls together and finish up on the porch. That's tonight's build along, if anybody has any questions.
Greg, did
Do
you
you
talk to?
do both sides of your walls?
I did not. I braced my walls so that I don't have to. Now, if you were going to detail the interior or if you're going to light the interior, then you'll want to consider painting the inside of the walls, either a dark color if you're going to light them,